Spring break 2017 was one that I will never forget, but not for any good reason like you might think. No, that spring break was one of the most uncomfortable experiences of my life. And to make things worse, my wife, who was my girlfriend at the time, was there to experience the exact same thing. That year, we decided to go on a week-long road trip to the Grand Canyon, and along the way, we planned on staying at various Airbnbs. We figured that even though it might turn out to be a bit more expensive than your typical hotel or motel, the comfort of an Airbnb could be worth it. The proof was in the first place we stayed on our trip to the Grand Canyon. It was this beautiful little cottage in a small fenced-in yard, and it was so nice that we wanted to stay there again on our way back. Sadly, the place had already been booked, so we were forced to go with another option on our trip home from the Grand Canyon. And on the surface, this place should have been just as nice, if not nicer, than the first place we stayed at. It was a small one-bedroom house that was situated right at the foot of a small hiking trail with a dirt pathway leading up to the house from the road. We were making good time on our return trip, and when we got to the Airbnb, we decided that it would be nice to check out the area, so we actually ended up going down the hiking trail. However, we were both surprised to discover that it only went into the woods about a half a mile and stopped at another small cabin-like building that on the surface looked like it was in ruin. But as I got closer, I could see furnishings through the window, and we figured that it was most likely a second Airbnb owned by the same person. And after looking around a bit, Tracy and I made our way back to the house we rented out. The sun went down shortly after we made it back to our cabin, and we decided to have a bit of an early dinner and try to get a good night's sleep before hitting the road in the morning. We cooked our food and enjoyed each other's company while we ate, and then when the time came, we both got ready to go to sleep. But I remember my wife telling me as we were laying down that something was a bit weird about this Airbnb. I thought it was so funny that she said that because as we were eating, I got the same feeling. But I reassured her that we would both just sleep for a few hours and be on the road before the sun was all the way up, and shortly after we both began to drift away. I must have been asleep for a couple of hours before I woke up and had to use the bathroom. I quietly rolled out of bed, doing my best not to wake Tracy, and began slowly making my way through the dark Airbnb as I looked for the bathroom. As I crossed the small hallway and into the bathroom, I noticed something that made me stop for a second. I closed and reopened my eyes to let them readjust as I turned back towards the windows at the end of the hallway just to the right of the bedroom. And I was surprised to see that the window had been left wide open, which was not how we left it before going to bed. I immediately knew that someone was in the house with us and began looking around, but it didn't take long for me to find them. As I poked my head back into the room that Tracy and I had been sleeping in, I could see right in the corner beside the nightstand on my wife's side of the bed, the silhouette of a man standing over the bed. I couldn't see his face, but I could tell that he was looking right at me. Now, I didn't know what it was that woke Tracy up, but I'll never forget the sound of sheer terror in her scream as she opened her eyes to see the strange man standing in our bedroom. I quickly ran into the room and toward Tracy to protect her from whoever had broken into the Airbnb. But thankfully, the man decided to take off running as he pushed his way past me and out of the window that he came in from. After making sure Tracy was okay, I ran outside to see if I could find the person's car, but I was surprised when I heard the sound of whoever it was running down the trail toward the house we had found in the woods. We decided to call the police, who went out and looked for the person that broke in, and to their surprise, they discovered that the man who owned the Airbnb actually lived in that house in the woods. They arrested him after he confessed to breaking in while we were sleeping under the pretense of it was his building. However, when the police found pictures of previous guests sleeping at the Airbnb on the owner's nightstand, they figured they had enough to arrest him. Tracy and I promptly left that night and got a super early start on the rest of our trip home. During spring break on my 18th birthday, my parents decided to celebrate by getting one of those resort packages in Hawaii that are all-inclusive for all of us. And all in all, it was probably the best spring break I ever had and ever will have. That being said, it also happened to include what was arguably the scariest moment of my entire life. It was on the second day that we were staying there, and we rented out a large fishing boat that was going to take us deep sea fishing as well as scuba diving, and it was awesome. This was like nothing I had ever experienced before. Even being down in the depths of the water among the fish as massive sharks slowly began to surround us wasn't too terrifying once you realize that they aren't as interested in you as they are in knowing what exactly you are. However, that was during the daytime while the light was still able to breach the surface of the water. When the darkness set in, the ocean is an entirely different beast. I learned that the hard way after a long day of being out in the water with the scuba instructor. As a part of the rental program that we signed up for, it included a nice seafood dinner on the boat with anything that we caught that day. And by the time food was being laid out before us, you could see the sun setting beautifully on the horizon. Soon after, though, darkness engulfed the area, and the sea turned from a vibrant blue to a deep black color. Peering over the edge of the boat was like truly looking into an abyss of emptiness. After I finished my meal, I decided to sit on the back of the boat and take in the ocean air for a little bit longer before we took off and headed back to the resort. Sadly, I didn't realize that nobody had heard me when I said that was where I was going. As I sat there with my legs hanging over the edge of the boat and into the water, I felt a quick jerk as the boat began to accelerate forward. And before I could react, the force of the motion tossed me off of the boat into the dark waters below. I quickly scrambled to make my way back to the surface of the water, but when I did, I was horrified as I realized that the boat was still moving forward. Nobody knew that I was in the water. I knew that I only had a few seconds, and even then they might not have heard me, but I had to try, so I began screaming at the top of my lungs for my family to come back for me. I was so concerned about them leaving me behind that I hadn't even considered what creatures might be circling the deep waters below me. And when the boat finally slowed down and I could see the spotlight come on, I felt a brief moment of relief. However, that moment quickly faded as the sound of my mother from the boat began to yell out for me to start swimming toward the boat. At first, I was confused because I had hoped that they would just bring the boat back around to me considering how far away they had gotten. But then as I felt something large and rough slam up against the side of my body, I understood why she was panicking. I tried to reorient myself after being knocked into and began looking into the water around me. And I'll never forget the fear that I felt at that moment. I was only able to see the sections of the water that were being hit by the spotlight, meaning I only had about 3 or 4 feet of visibility. I tried my best not to panic, but there was nothing that I could do when I saw the large dark mass appear from the shadowy water and charge right into me. At that moment, I thought that I was done for. I figured that one of the sharks that I had seen earlier that day had come back and was in pure predator mode. Thankfully though, as I brought myself back up to the surface of the water, I felt a hand reach down and grab onto my shirt before pulling me up onto a small boat. It turned out that a nearby smaller fishing boat had actually seen me fall into the water from where they had been fishing and quickly rushed over to save me. From that moment on that night, I made sure to stay in the middle of the boat as we made it back to the hotel in the safety of the land. One thing that I've learned over the course of my decade or so of enjoying spring break vacations, it's that you should always stick to your original plan. When you start changing things is when you can put yourself into risky situations that you might not even realize you're in until it's too late. That's what happened during spring break of 2019 when my friends and I planned on going to California for what was supposed to be an all-girls trip. It was my friend Marcy, Steph, and myself who all planned on going to the beach, eating good food, and having a fun time with just us. However, when we got there, it was easy to see that the plan was going to change. Within our first hour on the beach, we had already been approached by a few guys who wanted to hang out with us, and at first, we didn't let anyone get involved in our plans and simply told them that we weren't interested. We changed that policy though when another girl that seemed like she was our age came over to us. She said that she was supposed to be hanging out with her cousins but couldn't find them and didn't want to be alone, so we told her that she could hang out with us for a while until she found her family. At first, we thought that we were doing her a favor because she seemed like she needed the help, but after 20 minutes, her cousins ended up coming over. And I could tell right away that Steph was practically in love with one of them at first sight. He said his name was Chris and immediately thanked us for looking after his cousin. We told him that it wasn't a problem, and before long, Steph was giving him her number. After that, my friends and I parted ways with the girl and her cousins, and I expected never to run into them again. But within a couple of minutes, Steph was telling us about a plan that she was making to go night swimming with Chris. Right away, Marcy and I began to say that it didn't seem like a good idea, but Steph was very headstrong and began telling us that she would go by herself if we didn't want to come. So, that night we decided to meet what was supposed to be just Chris, his brother, and their cousin who we met earlier that day. But as we made our way down onto the sand and toward the water, I noticed that there were more than 3 people on the beach. It was dark, so it was hard to tell exactly how many people were there, but I would say at least 6 or 7, and from the size of their bodies, I could tell that the girl we met earlier wasn't with them at all. I pointed out that something felt off to Marcy and Steph, and surprisingly, she actually agreed with us, and we decided that we should probably turn back around and start walking back toward the road. But before we could start to walk the other way, we heard someone who sounded like Chris calling out, "Hey, where are you going?" We all stopped and looked back in their direction, only this time we could see that they were now walking toward us. I told my friends to keep walking as I yelled back to them, "Sorry, we actually realized that we need to get back to our family." And that was when I heard something that chilled me to the bones. One of the men that were with Chris tried to talk quietly, but I heard him say, "I thought you said they didn't come here with anyone, man." That was when I knew something was wrong. I told Marcy and Steph to run, and we all took off sprinting toward the road. The group of men began chasing after us. Thankfully, we made it out onto the sidewalk and into traffic before they could catch up. We all made sure to make a big scene to draw as much attention to us as possible, as we tried everything we could to keep those men away from us. After a minute, it was clear that the group had given up on chasing us, and we all quickly made our way back to our hotel, where we debated staying for the rest of our time in California. However, we figured that as long as we didn't do anything like that again, we would be fine, and we ended up having a decent time for the rest of our trip. I don't think I'll ever forget that fear and adrenaline I felt coursing through my body that night, though. I was truly horrified. My friends and I always hosted an annual beach bonfire for spring break every year, and almost every year it was an absolute hit. However, that all changed after spring break of '03 when a kid named John Boniface moved into the neighborhood. At first, the Boniface family seemed like they were pretty cool, and Mr. Boniface seemed super laid back. However, we all learned that year that things aren't always as they appear. Almost every year at the bonfire, we have a few people that bring some alcohol and tend to get a little drunk. But for the most part, it was just a bunch of us in the area who liked to watch the moon over the ocean and sit next to the fire listening to music. It turned out that John was one of those kids that quickly found his way over to the alcohol, and though none of us tried to stop him from drinking, we all made sure that no one got belligerent or became a danger to themselves or any of us. Sadly, we typically don't consider the parents. I'll never forget the pale look that came over John's face as we all saw headlights pulling up the parking lot on the edge of the beach. Right away, we could tell that it was Mr. Boniface because his car had a very distinct sound due to the busted exhaust. When he stepped out of his car and slammed the door shut, I think all of us knew that our little party was over. But I didn't think we could have ever expected him to do what he did next. Mr. Boniface made his way over to John, who had tried to drop the can of beer that he was holding before his dad could see it, but it was clear that his dad knew what was going on. We were all waiting to see what Mr. Boniface was going to say to John, but we were all taken aback when we saw his father pull his arm back and then take a swing at his son. Mr. Boniface began screaming a bunch of obscenities at John, who was now laying on the ground, and by that point, I decided to step in and try to defuse the situation. I walked over and asked Mr. Boniface to calm down, and I apologized for there being alcohol present, but I don't think he wanted to hear anything that I had to say. As soon as he realized that I had put the party together, he turned his attention toward me. I tried to back away as he began to walk toward me, but I hit my heel against something in the sand and ended up falling backward. And before I could get myself back up, Mr. Boniface was leaning over with his hand reached out and gripping onto my neck. He started yelling about me corrupting his kid, but what I'll never forget is the look in his eyes as he told me that nobody would ever miss me. It was at this point that I was certain that Mr. Boniface was trying to kill me, so I'm thankful my friend stepped in and actually managed to push the grown man off of me. I got up as quickly as I could and we all scattered in different directions. As soon as I and my friend Caleb got back to his house, we told his parents what happened and they called my parents, who then called the cops on Mr. Boniface. John's father was arrested for assaulting me and his son that night, and shortly after, his parents ended up splitting up and the family moved away. I was never really the type of girl that enjoyed going on crazy vacations. And growing up, I remember all of my friends used to try to fight me tooth and nail to go on trips with them. But I usually couldn't afford it, and when I could, I always felt guilty spending the money. There was one year though, during spring break, when my friends convinced me to go to Miami with them for the weekend. And after the semester I had, I figured that I could use a bit of rest and relaxation for once in my life. Sadly, that became a choice that I ended up regretting. It was just 4 of us, myself included, and we ended up renting out 2 connecting rooms in a hotel that was about a 20-minute walk from the beach that we wanted to go to. And that first day was a ton of fun, despite my reluctance to spend money on anything. I had some really good tasting food and the beach was really nice, even though it was super crowded. What I really enjoyed though was the first few hours of the night when all of the restaurants were using their lights to brighten everything up. It was really pretty. Honestly though, I was very surprised to see how quickly the nightlife seemed to die out in our area. It wasn't long before the streets seemed almost empty, and my friend and I decided to walk back to our hotel. We made it most of the way back, and I decided to grab a quick snack from the convenience store down the road from the hotel, so I told everyone to just go on ahead, figuring I would just meet them back at the rooms. Right away though, I wished that I had someone stay with me, because there was a man inside the store that was clearly drunk. And as soon as he saw that I was alone, he started talking to me. I respectfully asked the man to just let me grab my things and get back to my friends, and at first, it seemed like he wasn't offended by that. However, as soon as I started walking back to the hotel, I could hear someone walking behind me, and I was petrified to see that it was the drunk man from the store. I crossed the street and tried to make it into my hotel as quickly as I could, and as I waited for the elevator, I thought that I had lost him or that he had simply stopped following me. However, as soon as the doors opened up, I felt someone push me into the elevator from behind. I let out a loud scream as the doors closed behind me and the drunk man. He told me to push the number to my floor, and when I didn't, he lifted his hand into the air as if he was going to hit me. I couldn't help but start to cry as I didn't know what to do. There was no one else around to help me, and just at that moment, the elevator had begun to move. Someone had called it to another floor, and I'll never forget the panicked look on the drunk man's face as he tried to figure out what to do. He looked back down at me and lifted his hand again as he warned me to keep my mouth shut. Thankfully, I didn't listen. As soon as the elevator door opened, I saw 2 men waiting to get inside, and they could tell that I had been crying. I looked at them and pleaded for help, and before my attacker could even turn around, he was being ripped out the elevator and then pinned down. I pulled my phone out and called the police, who met me along with the 2 men and my attacker down in the lobby of the hotel where they arrested him. I bought the 2 men around from the hotel bar as a thank you for doing what I think surely saved my life.